Dr. Patricia Coleman stopped mid-stride through the Colorado sanctuary, her clipboard clattering to the concrete floor as she witnessed something that defied 8 years of veterinary expertise. Shadow, their 400-pound black bear with a legendary reputation for violence, was crying. The massive predator who had terrorized countless handlers now pressed his scarred snout against the chain-link fence, releasing haunting sobs that echoed through the morning air like a mourning song. Staff members froze in disbelief, their routine feeding forgotten as they stared at the impossible transformation unfolding before their eyes. The elderly man standing outside the enclosure trembled, his weathered hands gripping the metal links as tears streamed down his face. "Thunder," he whispered, his voice breaking with 8 years of desperate searching. Margaret Thompson, the sanctuary's longest volunteer, felt her knees buckle as she recognized the raw anguish in both man and beast. She had witnessed countless reunions in her 30 years here, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of recognition between two broken souls. "Get the director on the phone," Patricia commanded, her scientific mind reeling. Now! What had brought this man to their remote sanctuary? And why did their most dangerous animal suddenly seem like a heartbroken child? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Michael Harrison had never imagined that volunteering at Wild Heart Sanctuary would lead him back to the ghost that had haunted his dreams for 8 years. At 55, his weathered face told the story of a man who had fought too many battles and lost too many wars. The crow's feet around his blue eyes deepened when he smiled, though those moments had become increasingly rare since Patricia's death 3 years ago. He lived alone now in a cramped trailer on the outskirts of Denver, a far cry from the comfortable ranch house he'd shared with his wife during his 20-year career as Colorado's Parks and Wildlife Director. The medical bills from Patricia's 2-year battle with cancer had consumed their savings, their retirement fund, and eventually their home. But Michael had never regretted a penny spent fighting for her life, just as he had never stopped searching for Thunder. The sanctuary itself sprawled across 40 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, nestled between towering pines and rocky outcroppings that caught the morning light like ancient cathedrals. Dr. Patricia Coleman had built Wild Heart from nothing 15 years ago, transforming it into one of the most respected wildlife rehabilitation centers in the Rocky Mountain region. Her reputation for handling the most difficult cases had drawn animals from across the western states. Shadow had arrived 8 years ago under mysterious circumstances, a young bear already showing signs of severe psychological trauma. The distinctive V-shaped burn scar on his left shoulder told part of his story, but the rest remained locked behind aggressive behavior that had stumped every animal behaviorist who encountered him. At 400 pounds of solid muscle, Shadow commanded respect and fear in equal measure from the sanctuary staff. Margaret Thompson had been volunteering at Wild Heart since its inception, bringing the gentle wisdom that only comes from raising 6 children and burying 1 husband. At 62, she moved through the sanctuary like a surrogate mother to both animals and staff, her silver hair always pulled back in a practical bun, her pockets perpetually filled with treats and tissues. She had witnessed countless reunions between lost pets and their families, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was seeing today. Dr. Coleman prided herself on scientific objectivity, a trait that had served her well through veterinary school and 15 years of wildlife medicine. At 48, she had seen every possible behavior pattern in traumatized animals, documented their rehabilitation with meticulous care, and never once allowed emotion to cloud her professional judgment. Shadow's case had been her greatest failure, a brilliant animal locked behind walls of fear and rage that she couldn't breach. Frank Sullivan lived in the cabin next to Michael's trailer, a 78-year-old Vietnam veteran whose steady presence had become Michael's anchor during the darkest months following Patricia's death. Frank's weathered hands had held dying soldiers in Southeast Asian jungles and delivered countless grandchildren on his Montana ranch. He understood the weight of loss and the power of stubborn hope. This morning's volunteer shift had started like any other, but now everything had changed. The moment Michael's eyes met Shadow's through the chain-link fence, time seemed to fracture into before and after. The bear's massive head lifted slowly, those familiar dark eyes focusing with an intensity that sent shivers down Michael's spine. For 8 years, he had dreamed of this moment, imagined it in 1,000 different ways. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of seeing Thunder again. Shadow's distinctive V-shaped scar caught the morning light, that burn mark from their first night together when a falling ember had singed his tiny shoulder as Michael carried him from the burning forest. The scar had faded over the years, but Michael would have recognized it anywhere. His breath caught in his throat as memories flooded back with devastating clarity. The bear began to vocalize, not the aggressive growls that staff members had documented in his file, but something entirely different. Low, rhythmic sounds that started deep in his chest and rose to an almost musical quality. Michael's eyes widened in recognition. It was their song, the melody Thunder used to hum along with when Michael sang "You Are My Sunshine" during those precious months they'd spent together. Dr. Coleman watched in stunned silence as Shadow pressed his massive frame against the fence, his behavior transforming completely from the aggressive posture she'd witnessed thousands of times before. The bear's ears were forward, alert but not defensive. His body language spoke of desperate longing rather than territorial threat. She found herself reaching for her phone to record this unprecedented display, her scientific mind struggling to process what her eyes were showing her. Margaret Thompson felt tears welling in her eyes as she witnessed the raw emotion radiating from both man and beast. In her 30 years of volunteer work, she had seen countless reunions between lost pets and their families, but this transcended anything in her experience. The bear's vocalizations grew more urgent, almost pleading, as he stretched one massive paw through the fence toward Michael. Michael's legs felt weak as he approached the enclosure, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Thunder?" he whispered, his voice breaking on the name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Is that really you, boy?" Shadow's response was immediate and devastating. The bear's vocalizations intensified, taking on an almost crying quality that echoed across the sanctuary grounds. He began pressing his snout through the gaps in the chain link, trying desperately to reach the man who had once been his whole world. The sound that emerged from his throat was heartbreaking, a combination of joy and anguish that spoke of years of separation and longing. The other animals in nearby enclosures fell silent, as if sensing the magnitude of what was unfolding. Even the morning bird song seemed to pause in reverence for this moment of recognition between two souls who had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Michael's hands trembled as he reached toward the fence, his fingers nearly touching Shadow's outstretched paw. "I looked everywhere for you," he choked out, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I never stopped looking. Not for one single day." Dr. Coleman found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to step back slowly. Shadow has never shown this kind of behavior with anyone. We don't know how he might react if he becomes overstimulated." But Michael couldn't move away. 8 years of searching, of following false leads and dead ends, of lying awake at night wondering if Thunder was still alive somewhere, had all led to this moment. The bear who had once fit in the palm of his hands was now a magnificent 400-pound animal, but those eyes held the same intelligence, the same gentle soul that had comforted Michael through the darkest period of his life. Margaret stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding protocol. "Patricia, look at him. Really look at both of them. I've been watching animals and people connect for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. That bear knows him." Shadow's behavior became increasingly frantic as he sensed the human's uncertainty. He began pacing along the fence line, never taking his eyes off Michael, his vocalizations growing more desperate. The sound was unlike anything Dr. Coleman had documented in her extensive files on bear communication. It was personal, intimate, a private language between two beings who had once shared everything. "You have to understand," Michael said, his voice gaining strength as he fought to stay composed. "This isn't Shadow. This is Thunder. I raised him from a cub after his mother died in the 2016 forest fires. We were together for 3 months before Wildlife Services took him away. I've been searching for him ever since." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the sanctuary staff thought they knew about their most dangerous resident. Dr. Coleman's scientific skepticism warred with the evidence unfolding before her eyes. She had built her career on observable facts and documented behaviors, not emotional testimonies from grieving men. Yet Shadow's transformation was undeniable, and it challenged everything in his file. She pulled out her phone and began recording, her veterinary training demanding documentation of this unprecedented interaction. "Mr. Harrison," she said carefully, "Shadow has been with us for 8 years. He arrived as a young adult bear with severe behavioral issues and trauma indicators. His aggression levels have been consistently documented as extreme. What you're describing would mean he was separated from you as a very young cub, which would make this level of recognition virtually impossible according to current research on bear memory and human-animal bonding." Michael's jaw tightened with frustration that had built over nearly a decade of being dismissed by officials. "Lady, I don't care what your research says. I know my boy. Look at him. Really look at him. When has he ever acted like this with anyone else?" Shadow seemed to sense the tension in Michael's voice and responded by intensifying his vocalizations. The bear began a rhythmic huffing sound, punctuated by what could only be described as whimpers. Margaret gasped as she recognized the pattern. It was unmistakably the rhythm of "You Are My Sunshine," the same melody she'd heard Michael humming while cleaning enclosures earlier that morning. "Dear God," Margaret whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "He's singing to you." Dr. Coleman's phone captured every sound as she struggled to maintain professional objectivity. "Even if what you're claiming is true, Mr. Harrison, you would have been in violation of federal wildlife protection laws. Keeping an orphaned bear cub without proper permits is a felony. I'd be obligated to report this to state authorities." Michael's eyes flashed with 8 years of accumulated anger and grief. "You think I don't know that? You think I didn't weigh every risk before I took him in? His mother was dead, burned alive in that fire. He was maybe 8 weeks old, starving, and the nearest wildlife facility was 300 miles away through roads that were still closed. By the time I could have gotten him there, he would have been dead." Frank Sullivan chose that moment to arrive for his volunteer shift, his weathered pickup truck crunching over the gravel driveway. At 78, the Vietnam veteran had seen enough of life to recognize a crisis brewing. He approached the group slowly, taking in the scene with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive in Southeast Asian jungles. "What's all the commotion about?" Frank asked, but his question was answered immediately as Shadow caught sight of him. The bear's vocalizations shifted to excited chirping sounds, a greeting Frank had heard countless times during the months Michael had cared for the cub in secret. Frank's weathered face went pale. "Sweet Jesus, Michael, is that Thunder?" Dr. Coleman turned sharply toward the old veteran. "You knew about this?" Frank's loyalty to his neighbor warred with his respect for authority, a conflict that had defined much of his post-war life. "Ma'am, I was there the night Michael found him. Barely bigger than a house cat, burned and half dead. We both knew it wasn't legal, but sometimes a man has to choose between what's right and what's written in some book. Margaret felt her worldview shifting as she watched the three men navigate their shared secret. She had dedicated her life to following rules and protocols, trusting that institutions knew best. But the evidence before her eyes suggested that sometimes love and compassion transcended legal boundaries. Shadow's behavior became increasingly frantic as he sensed the adults' conflict. He began pacing along the fence line with renewed urgency, his massive paws leaving deep impressions in the dirt. The bear's distress was palpable, and Dr. Coleman found herself torn between professional protocol and animal welfare. The fire was in late September 2016, Michael continued, his voice gaining strength as he shared the burden he'd carried alone for so long. I was leading the evacuation team in Sector 7 when I heard crying coming from under a fallen lodge pole pine. I almost walked past, thought it was just the wind, but something made me stop and listen. Frank nodded grimly. That fire burned for 6 weeks, lost over 100,000 acres, and took 3 lives. Michael here pulled that cub out of hell itself. Dr. Coleman lowered her phone, the weight of their testimony beginning to penetrate her scientific defenses. If this is true, where has he been for the past 8 years? Our records show Shadow arrived from a facility in Wyoming that was shutting down operations. That's what I've been trying to figure out, Michael said, his frustration evident. I came home one morning and Thunder was gone. Wildlife Services said they'd relocated him to a temporary facility, but when I tried to visit, they told me he'd been moved again. Every lead went nowhere. Every facility denied having him. It was like he'd disappeared into thin air. Shadow suddenly reared up on his hind legs, pressing his full weight against the fence. At his full height, he towered nearly 7 feet tall, but there was nothing threatening in his posture. Instead, he extended one massive paw through the chain link toward Michael in an unmistakable gesture of reaching. Margaret Thompson, who had spent 3 decades reading animal body language, felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's not aggression," she said softly. "That's a child asking to be held by his father." The morning sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary grounds as the small group stood frozen in the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Shadow's cries echoed through the Colorado wilderness, a sound of longing so pure and desperate that it seemed to touch something primal in all of them. Dr. Coleman realized that her next decision would determine not just Shadow's fate, but the trajectory of all their lives. Dr. Coleman made the decision that would change all their lives. "I'm calling an emergency staff meeting," she announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Margaret, please contact our board members. Frank, I need you to help Michael document everything he remembers about Thunder's early care. And Mr. Harrison, I need you to understand that if we pursue this, there will be consequences none of us can predict." Within 2 hours, Wild Heart Sanctuary's conference room buzzed with tension as staff members, volunteers, and 3 board members gathered around the oak table that had witnessed countless difficult decisions over the years. Dr. Coleman had called in favors to assemble this emergency session, knowing that Shadow's fate hung in the balance of the next few hours. Michael sat at one end of the table, his calloused hands folded tightly as he faced a room full of skeptical faces. He had spent the morning documenting Thunder's rescue and care, filling pages with details he'd never shared with another soul. The burn patterns on the cub's shoulder, the specific vocalizations he'd developed, the way he'd learned to communicate hunger, contentment, and fear through distinct sounds that Michael had painstakingly cataloged. Board Chairman Robert Hayes, a retired Denver businessman with silver hair and an expensive suit, leaned back in his chair with obvious skepticism. "Mr. Harrison, what you're describing sounds like an emotional fantasy created by grief and loss. Bears don't form the kind of long-term emotional bonds you're suggesting, especially not after 8 years of separation. Frank Sullivan bristled from his corner chair. Bob, I was there. I saw that cub every day for 3 months. I watched him learn to trust again after losing his mother. You want to talk about emotional bonds? That little bear used to cry every time Michael left the cabin, and he'd wait by the window until he came back. Margaret had spent the past hour reviewing Shadow's behavioral records, and her findings painted a disturbing picture. I've been through his files going back 8 years, she said, spreading papers across the table. Look at this pattern. Shadow's aggressive episodes always coincide with visits from potential adopters or researchers. It's like he's deliberately sabotaging any chance of being placed elsewhere. Dr. Coleman projected Shadow's medical records onto the conference room screen, highlighting specific behavioral observations. Here's what's bothering me most. Shadow's aggression has always been selective. He's never attacked a staff member who's shown genuine care, only those who've tried to assert dominance or control. That's not typical of traumatized bears. It suggests sophisticated emotional intelligence. Board member Sarah Chen, a wildlife psychologist from Colorado State University, leaned forward with interest. Patricia, have you documented any unusual vocalizations? Bears typically have a limited range of sounds they use for human interaction. Michael's eyes lit up with the first spark of hope he'd felt in hours. Thunder learned over 20 different sounds. He had specific calls for hungry, scared, happy, wanting to play. He even learned to mimic parts of songs I used to sing to him. Dr. Coleman nodded slowly. Shadow does exhibit unusual vocal patterns. I've recorded sounds from him that don't match standard bear communication models. I always attributed it to psychological trauma, but if Mr. Harrison is correct. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. Robert Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. Even if we accept Mr. Harrison's story, we have legal obligations. Wild Heart Sanctuary operates under federal and state permits that strictly prohibit returning animals to unauthorized private care. Michael's composure finally cracked. I'm not asking to take him home with me. I just want him to know he wasn't abandoned. I want him to understand that I looked for him every single day for 8 years. I sold my house, my truck, everything I owned trying to find him. My wife died while I was chasing leads in Montana, and I wasn't there to hold her hand because I was too busy failing to find my boy. The raw pain in his voice silenced the room's objections. Margaret reached across the table to touch his arm, her maternal instincts overriding procedural concerns. Michael, honey, you can't blame yourself for Patricia's death. Cancer took her, not your search for thunder. Frank Sullivan's weathered face hardened as he addressed the board members. Let me tell you something about this man. I've known Michael Harrison for 15 years. I watched him sit beside his wife's hospital bed for 6 months, never missing a day. I watched him work 3 jobs to pay for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. And when she died, I watched him honor her by continuing to search for the only family he had left. Dr. Coleman felt the weight of professional responsibility warring with growing personal conviction. The problem isn't whether we believe Mr. Harrison's story. The problem is what happens when we report this to state wildlife authorities. If Shadow really is thunder, then Michael violated federal law by keeping him without permits. The penalties could include substantial fines and possible jail time. Board member James Martinez, a retired federal judge, spoke up for the first time. There's another consideration here. If this bear has indeed been separated from his primary caregiver for 8 years, and if his behavioral problems stem from that separation, then his continued captivity without proper psychological intervention could be considered animal cruelty. The implications of his words rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Sarah Chen began flipping through her notes with renewed urgency. James is right. Long-term psychological trauma in highly intelligent animals can manifest as the kind of aggression we've documented in Shadow. If Michael's story is true, we might be looking at 8 years of undiagnosed depression and anxiety. Michael lifted his head, hope flickering in his tired eyes. All I want is a chance to help him heal. I don't need to own him or take him anywhere. But he needs to know that someone fought for him. He needs to understand that he was loved. Robert Hayes removed his glasses and rubbed his temples, the weight of decision-making evident in his posture. Dr. Coleman, what would limited supervised contact look like? What safeguards would we need? Before Patricia could answer, her phone buzzed with an urgent message. Her face went pale as she read the screen. "We have a problem. Vincent Morrison, from the Colorado Wildlife Commission, is requesting an immediate inspection of our facility. He's specifically asking about our aggressive bear cases." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Vincent Morrison had built his reputation on strict enforcement of wildlife regulations, and his inspections rarely ended well for facilities that operated in ethical gray areas. His arrival would mean scrutiny that Wild Heart Sanctuary couldn't afford, especially with their current permit renewal pending. Frank Sullivan's military instincts activated. "How much time do we have?" "Doctor." Coleman checked her phone again. "He's requesting access tomorrow morning. That gives us maybe 18 hours to figure out how to handle this situation." Margaret Thompson, who had remained quiet during the heated discussions, suddenly spoke with quiet authority that commanded attention. "I've been thinking about something. Michael, you mentioned that Thunder learned to sing along with 'You Are My Sunshine.' That's very specific. If Shadow really is Thunder, he should remember that song even after 8 years of separation." Michael nodded eagerly. "It was our bedtime ritual. Every night, without fail. Even when he got bigger and could have easily broken free from the cabin, he'd settle down the moment I started singing." Dr. Coleman felt a plan forming in her mind, risky but potentially definitive. "Here's what I propose. We conduct a controlled test before Morrison arrives. If Shadow responds to Mr. Harrison singing that specific song in the way you've described, it would provide compelling evidence of their previous relationship. If there's no response, we'll know this is a case of mistaken identity and wishful thinking." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the stakes. If Michael was wrong, he would face the devastating realization that Thunder was truly gone forever. If he was right, they would all be complicit in a situation that challenged the fundamental assumptions about wildlife management and animal-human bonds. Robert Hayes finally spoke. "All in favor of allowing this supervised test?" Hands rose around the table, some hesitant, others firm. The vote was unanimous. Michael felt 8 years of desperate hope crystallize into a single moment of possibility. Tomorrow, he would discover whether his boy had truly come home, or whether he had been chasing ghosts through the wilderness of his own broken heart. Outside the conference room windows, Shadow paced restlessly in his enclosure, as if sensing that his fate was being decided by the humans whose voices carried on the autumn wind. The morning of Vincent Morrison's arrival dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the Rocky Mountain peaks like harbingers of the conflict to come. Michael had spent a sleepless night in his trailer, alternating between desperate hope and paralyzing fear that Thunder might not remember their song after 8 years of separation. Frank had stayed with him through the dark hours, sharing coffee and war stories that served as gentle distractions from the magnitude of what lay ahead. Dr. Coleman arrived at the sanctuary before sunrise, her nerves stretched taut as she prepared for what could be either vindication or professional suicide. She had staked her reputation on Michael's story, and if she was wrong, Vincent Morrison would ensure that Wild Heart Sanctuary paid the ultimate price. Her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed Shadow's medical files one final time, searching for any detail that might support or contradict Michael's claims. Margaret Thompson bustled around the observation area, setting up cameras and recording equipment with the efficiency of a woman who had organized countless family gatherings and school events. At 62, she understood that documentation would be crucial regardless of the outcome. Her maternal instincts told her that Michael was telling the truth, but her practical nature demanded evidence that could withstand official scrutiny. Shadow paced restlessly in his enclosure, his massive frame moving with an agitation that had intensified overnight. The bear's behavior had become increasingly erratic since the previous day's emotional encounter, and Dr. Coleman worried that the stress might trigger an aggressive episode that would undermine everything they were trying to prove. His dark eyes kept returning to the spot where Michael had stood, as if willing the man to reappear. Vincent Morrison arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, his official vehicle crunching over the gravel driveway with the authority of federal enforcement. At 52, Morrison carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had built his career on unwavering adherence to regulations. His gray hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform pressed with military precision, and his pale blue eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had never doubted the righteousness of his mission. "Dr. Coleman," Morrison said, extending a firm handshake that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. "I understand you've been having some unusual developments with your aggressive bear case. I'm here to assess whether Wild Heart Sanctuary is maintaining proper protocols for dangerous animal management." Patricia felt her stomach tighten as she led Morrison toward the conference room where Michael, Frank, and Margaret waited. She had deliberately scheduled the test for after Morrison's initial inspection, hoping to present him with documented evidence rather than emotional testimony. But she could see in his eyes that he had already made his judgment about their capabilities. "Mr. Morrison," she began carefully, "before we discuss Shadow's case, I want you to meet someone who may have crucial information about the bear's history. This is Michael Harrison, a former Colorado Parks and Wildlife Director." Morrison's expression sharpened with interest and suspicion. "Harrison. I remember that name. You left Parks and Wildlife under somewhat controversial circumstances, if I recall correctly. Something about unauthorized wildlife interactions." Michael's jaw tightened, but Frank placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Sir, I resigned to care for my dying wife. There was nothing controversial about putting family first." "Of course," Morrison replied with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And now you're here making claims about our problem bear. Dr. Coleman briefed me on your theory. It's an interesting story, Mr. Harrison, but it flies in the face of established science about bear behavior and memory retention." Margaret stepped forward with the protective instincts of a woman who had spent decades defending underdogs. "Mr. Morrison, we're not asking you to take anyone's word for anything. We're proposing a controlled test that will provide objective evidence one way or another." Morrison's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate your volunteer service, but wildlife management isn't a democracy. We don't make decisions based on sentimental theories proposed by well-meaning civilians. Shadow is a dangerous animal with documented aggressive behavior. The appropriate course of action is clear." The implication in his words sent a chill through the room. "Doctor." Coleman realized that Morrison hadn't come to investigate Shadow's case. He had come to justify a predetermined conclusion. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Morrison?" "I'm suggesting that Wild Heart Sanctuary has allowed emotional attachment to cloud professional judgment. A bear that exhibits persistent aggressive behavior despite years of rehabilitation attempts represents an ongoing public safety threat. The humane solution is obvious." Michael felt the blood drain from his face as the full weight of Morrison's words hit him. "You're talking about euthanizing him." "I'm talking about responsible wildlife management," Morrison replied coldly. Sentiment has no place in public safety decisions, Mr. Harrison. Surely your parks and wildlife experience taught you that basic principle. Frank Sullivan's military bearing straightened as he recognized a battle forming. Morrison, that bear hasn't hurt anybody in 8 years. You're talking about killing an animal based on theoretical threats rather than actual behavior. Morrison turned his pale gaze on the old veteran. Mr. Sullivan, I don't recall requesting civilian input on wildlife policy. This is a professional assessment based on documented evidence, not emotional testimony from neighbors and volunteers. The dismissive tone ignited something fierce in Margaret Thompson. Documented evidence? You mean the evidence that shows Shadow has never actually attacked a human being? The evidence that shows his aggressive behavior is limited to defensive posturing when strangers enter his space? That evidence? Dr. Coleman watched the confrontation escalate with growing alarm. Morrison's rigid adherence to protocol was colliding head-on with the emotional investment her team had developed in Shadow's case. She realized that the test she had planned might be their only chance to prevent a tragedy that would haunt them all forever. Mr. Morrison, she said, injecting authority into her voice, I'm invoking my right as facility director to request a 48-hour assessment period before any final decisions are made. As a licensed veterinarian and wildlife specialist, I have the professional standing to demand proper evaluation protocols. Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously. Dr. Coleman, you seem to be forgetting that Wild Heart Sanctuary operates under permits that I have the authority to suspend or revoke. Your facility's continued operation depends on maintaining compliance with federal wildlife regulations. I would be very careful about challenging my assessment procedures. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a forest fire, toxic and all-consuming. Michael realized that Morrison wasn't just threatening Shadow's life. He was threatening to destroy the sanctuary that had become home to dozens of rescued animals. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything they had imagined. Margaret felt tears of frustration burning her eyes. Mr. Morrison, all we're asking for is one chance to prove that Shadow isn't the dangerous animal you think he is. If we're wrong, you can proceed with whatever action you deem appropriate. But if we're right, an innocent animal dies because we didn't have the courage to challenge assumptions. Morrison checked his watch with theatrical precision. You have 15 minutes to present your evidence, Dr. Coleman, but I warn you, I won't be swayed by emotional demonstrations or anecdotal testimony. I require objective, measurable proof that this animal poses no public safety threat. Michael's hands began to shake as the weight of the moment settled over him. Everything. Shadow's life, the sanctuary's future, his own chance at redemption, depended on whether an 8-year-old memory could bridge the gap between a broken man and a traumatized bear. If Thunder had forgotten their song, if the connection he'd felt so certain about was nothing more than wishful thinking, then he would have failed his boy for the final time. Dr. Coleman led the group toward Shadow's enclosure, her professional composure masking the terror that gripped her heart. She had bet everything on Michael's story, and now they would all discover together whether love could truly transcend species boundaries and survive 8 years of separation. Shadow sensed their approach long before they came into view. His pacing intensified, and his vocalizations took on an urgent quality that carried across the sanctuary grounds. Other animals in nearby enclosures fell silent, as if sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Morrison pulled out his tablet and prepared to document what he clearly expected to be another failed rehabilitation attempt. Proceed, Dr. Coleman. But remember, this animal's behavior will be evaluated strictly according to federal safety standards, not emotional wishful thinking. Michael stepped toward the fence with legs that felt like water, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether Thunder would live or die, and whether the song that had once bound them together could save them both one more time. The 15 minutes Vincent Morrison had granted them felt like an eternity compressed into heartbeats as Michael approached Thunder's enclosure with legs that threatened to buckle beneath him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary grounds, but all Michael could see was the massive black bear lying motionless in the corner of his prison, a 400-pound symbol of everything that had gone wrong in both their lives. Dr. Coleman positioned herself strategically with her recording equipment, her scientific training warring with the emotional investment she had developed in this impossible reunion. Margaret Thompson stood beside her, hands clasped in prayer-like desperation, while Frank Sullivan maintained his protective stance near the fence line. Morrison checked his watch with theatrical precision, his pale eyes gleaming with anticipation of professional vindication. Michael's voice cracked as he began the first tentative notes of "You Are My Sunshine," the melody that had once filled their cabin with warmth and belonging. The sound seemed to fracture the morning air, carrying 8 years of grief and longing across the space that separated man from bear. His hands trembled against the chain-link fence as the familiar words spilled from his lips, each note a prayer offered to whatever remained of the cub he had loved like a son. Thunder's ear twitched almost imperceptibly, the first response he had shown to human presence in over 24 hours. The massive bear's breathing seemed to settle into a slightly more regular rhythm, though his head remained pressed against his paws in the corner of the enclosure. Dr. Coleman's breath caught as she documented this minimal but significant change in behavior, her camera capturing every subtle shift in the bear's posture. "My only sunshine," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger despite the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You make me happy when skies are gray." The melody carried across the sanctuary grounds like a benediction, causing other animals in nearby enclosures to fall silent, as if sensing the sacred nature of what was unfolding. Morrison's confident smirk began to waver as Thunder's massive head slowly, painfully, lifted from where it had been buried in his paws. The bear's dark eyes, dulled by days of refusing food and the weight of 8 years of trauma, began to focus with visible effort on the source of the familiar sound. Margaret gasped softly as she witnessed the first spark of recognition flickering in those intelligent eyes. Thunder's massive frame began to tremble, not with fear or aggression, but with what could only be described as overwhelming emotion. The sound that emerged from his throat was unlike anything Dr. Coleman had documented in his extensive behavioral files, a low musical humming that perfectly matched the melody Michael was singing. The bear was harmonizing with their song, remembering their private language of love and comfort that had once made sense of a world turned upside down by fire and loss. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you," Michael sang through his tears, his voice breaking on every word as Thunder slowly, agonizingly, began to move toward the front of his enclosure. The bear's movements were labored and uncertain, weakened by days without food and the psychological weight of confronting memories that had been buried beneath years of systematic abuse. Morrison stepped forward aggressively, his bureaucratic authority threatened by the undeniable evidence unfolding before his eyes. "This proves nothing," he declared harshly. "Trained responses to auditory stimuli are well documented in captive animals. This bear could have learned to respond to music from previous handlers." But even as Morrison spoke, Thunder was displaying behaviors that transcended simple conditioning. The bear approached the fence with the distinctive swaying gait that Michael remembered from their morning walks around the cabin. Thunder's massive head tilted to one side in the curious gesture that had always preceded his requests for attention or play. Most remarkably, the bear began to vocalize in the specific pattern of huffs and whimpers that had once meant hello in their private communication system. Frank Sullivan's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile anyone had seen from the old veteran in months. "Morrison, I may not know much about animal psychology, but I know recognition when I see it. That bear remembers his daddy, Doctor." Coleman's scientific objectivity crumbled as she watched Thunder press his scarred snout through the gaps in the chain-link fence, breathing in Michael's scent with the desperate intensity of someone confirming the reality of an impossible dream. The bear's behavior bore no resemblance to the aggressive posturing she had documented for months. This was pure, undiluted love expressing itself across species boundaries and 8 years of enforced separation. "Please don't take my sunshine away," Michael whispered the final line of their song, reaching through the fence to touch Thunder's massive paw with fingers that shook with 8 years of accumulated hope and grief. The moment their skin made contact, Thunder released a sound that was part whimper, part song, and entirely filled with the joy of a child who had finally found his way home. Margaret Thompson wept openly as she witnessed the bear's transformation from dangerous predator to heartbroken son, recognizing his father. Thunder's entire body language changed in that moment of contact, his defensive posture melting away to reveal the gentle soul that had been hidden beneath layers of institutional trauma and systematic abuse. Morrison's face flushed with anger and frustration as his carefully constructed narrative collapsed before his eyes. "This is highly irregular," he sputtered, his authority undermined by the undeniable evidence of the bond between Michael and Thunder. "Even if this animal shows recognition, it doesn't change his documented history of aggressive behavior. Public safety remains the primary concern." But Thunder was already proving Morrison wrong through his actions. The bear, who had terrorized handlers for months, was now performing the gentle head-pressing gesture that Michael remembered as a request for comfort. Thunder's massive frame seemed to shrink as he tried to make himself smaller, less threatening, in the desperate hope of maintaining this precious contact with the human who represented safety and love in a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. Dr. Coleman found her voice as a medical professional override her personal emotions. "Mr. Morrison, I'm documenting clear evidence of species-specific bonding behaviors that cannot be explained by conditioning or training. This bear is exhibiting attachment patterns consistent with early imprinting on a human caregiver. The implications for his psychological treatment are enormous." Jake Sullivan, still maintaining his cover as a volunteer, stepped forward with carefully controlled excitement. "Dr. Coleman is right. I've been observing Shadow for months, and I've never seen him display this level of trust or emotional regulation with any human. Whatever his relationship with Mr. Harrison, it's clearly therapeutic." Thunder's recovery from his near-death state seemed to accelerate with each moment of contact with Michael. The bear, who had refused food for 6 days, suddenly showed interest in the apple that Michael pulled from his pocket, accepting the fruit through the fence with the gentle precision that had once charmed visitors to their cabin. Morrison realized that his authority was slipping away with each passing moment of this impossible reunion. The euthanization order he had been prepared to issue now seemed not just premature, but potentially criminal in the face of such clear evidence of the bear's capacity for recovery through reconnection with his human family. As Thunder settled into a resting position while maintaining constant visual contact with Michael, it became clear that love had indeed proven stronger than institutional bureaucracy, and that some bonds transcend the boundaries that humans impose between species, time, and trauma. The truth erupted like a dam bursting under pressure when Jake Sullivan stepped forward, his FBI credentials gleaming in the afternoon light. Vincent Morrison's face went ashen as the young agent he'd dismissed as a naive volunteer revealed his true identity, and the carefully constructed web of lies that had defined the last 8 years began to unravel with devastating speed. "Vincent Morrison," Jake announced with the authority of federal law enforcement, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, wildlife trafficking, fraud, and the illegal transport of protected animals across state lines." The handcuffs clicked with a finality that echoed across the sanctuary grounds as Morrison's empire of cruelty collapsed in real time. Dr. Coleman stared in shock as Jake explained how his undercover investigation had been tracking Morrison's wildlife trafficking network for 2 years. "Thunder was never transferred to a legitimate facility," Jake revealed, his voice heavy with the weight of truth. "Morrison sold him to an illegal breeding operation in Wyoming when he was barely 2 years old. The operation used him as breeding stock for black market exotic animal sales until it was raided last year." Michael felt his knees buckle as the full scope of Morrison's betrayal became clear. The man who had looked him in the eye 8 years ago and promised that Thunder would be placed in the best possible facility had instead sold a traumatized cub to criminals who saw him only as a commodity. The months of isolation, the breeding attempts, the constant stress of captivity had broken Thunder's spirit long before he'd arrived at Wild Heart Sanctuary. Margaret Thompson's maternal fury blazed as she confronted the handcuffed Morrison. "You knew Michael was searching for him. You knew he was spending every penny he had, destroying his health, missing his wife's final moments, and you said nothing. You watched that man suffer for 8 years when you could have ended it with a phone call." Morrison's cold facade finally cracked, revealing the twisted psychology that had driven his crusade against human-animal bonds. "My son David was 7 years old when that bear mauled him to death," he snarled, his voice breaking with 8 years of suppressed rage. 7 years old, and he died screaming while I watched. Every time I see people treating these monsters like pets, I see my boy's face. Every bear that dies makes the world safer for children like David." Frank Sullivan's military bearing stiffened as he processed Morrison's confession. "Son, I've seen what war does to a man's mind, and I recognize the signs. Your boy's death broke something in you, but that doesn't give you the right to destroy other people's families. Doctor." Coleman struggled to comprehend how Morrison had maintained his deception while orchestrating Thunder's suffering. "You've been manipulating Shadow's behavioral assessments, the aggression reports, the failed rehabilitation attempts. You've been setting him up for euthanization from the moment he arrived here." Jake nodded grimly as he secured Morrison in the back of his vehicle. "Morrison's been targeting facilities that specialize in human-animal rehabilitation. He identifies animals with strong emotional bonds to their caretakers, then uses his authority to separate them and ensure they're classified as dangerous. Thunder is just one of dozens of animals whose lives he's destroyed in the name of his twisted version of public safety." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled group as they realized the scope of Morrison's psychological manipulation. Shadow's 8 years of documented aggression hadn't been the result of natural trauma. They had been the deliberate product of a man using his grief as justification for systemic cruelty. Michael's hands shook with rage as he watched Morrison being driven away. "He stole 8 years from us. Thunder suffered for 8 years because of his revenge fantasy. My wife died while I was chasing shadows because he couldn't face his own pain." Dr. Coleman felt the weight of professional failure crushing down on her. "I should have seen the signs. Shadow's behavioral patterns never quite fit standard trauma profiles. But I trusted Morrison's assessments because of his reputation. I let institutional authority override my clinical instincts." Margaret placed a comforting hand on Patricia's shoulder. "Honey, you can't blame yourself for trusting someone in authority. Morrison spent years building credibility, specifically so people would believe his lies. The important thing now is helping Thunder heal from what was done to him." Shadow's condition had deteriorated rapidly during Morrison's final visit, as if the bear had sensed the malevolent presence of the man who had orchestrated his years of suffering. His refusal to eat had entered its fourth day, and Dr. Coleman worried that the psychological trauma of Morrison's proximity had triggered a complete shutdown of his survival instincts. Jake provided crucial details about Thunder's treatment during the missing years that explained his current psychological state. The breeding operation kept him in a concrete enclosure barely large enough for him to turn around. They used food deprivation and physical intimidation to control his behavior. When the facility was raided, Thunder was found in a state of severe malnutrition and psychological collapse. The behavioral patterns that had puzzled Dr. Coleman for months suddenly made heartbreaking sense. Shadow's selective aggression toward authority figures, his panic responses to confined spaces, his desperate attempts to communicate through vocalizations that staff couldn't understand, all of it stemmed from years of systematic abuse designed to break his spirit and eliminate his capacity for trust. Frank Sullivan's weathered face hardened as he processed the implications of Thunder's suffering. That boy has been trying to survive hell for 8 years, and we've been treating him like he's the problem. No wonder he couldn't trust anyone. After what they did to him, I'm surprised he remembers how to hope at all. Michael approached Thunder's enclosure with new understanding of the psychological barriers that separated them. The bear, who had once greeted each day with joyful vocalizations, had learned that hope led only to disappointment, that trust resulted in betrayal, that love was a weakness that predators exploited. Rebuilding their connection would require patience and gentleness that went beyond anything Michael had experienced during their original bonding period. Dr. Coleman began developing a comprehensive rehabilitation plan based on Jake's intelligence about Thunder's treatment history. We need to address not just the behavioral symptoms, but the underlying trauma that created them. This isn't about training an aggressive animal. This is about helping a torture victim remember what safety feels like. The legal implications of Morrison's arrest rippled through the wildlife management community as news of his trafficking network spread. Dozens of cases would need to be reviewed, animals would need to be relocated to appropriate facilities, and the entire system of oversight that had enabled his crimes would require fundamental restructuring. Margaret organized a support network of volunteers committed to Thunder's rehabilitation, understanding that his recovery would require consistent patient care from people willing to earn his trust gradually. That bear has been betrayed by every human authority figure in his life except Michael. We need to show him that not all people are monsters. Michael spent hours sitting beside Thunder's enclosure, not trying to interact but simply being present as the bear processed the departure of his tormentor. The psychological damage went deeper than behavioral conditioning. Thunder had learned to associate human proximity with pain, and unlearning that association would take time that Michael wasn't sure they had. Dr. Coleman monitored Thunder's vital signs with growing concern as his refusal to eat entered its 5th day. His body is beginning to shut down from stress and malnutrition. If we can't get him to eat soon, we'll lose him regardless of everything we've learned about his past. The sanctuary fell into a hushed vigilance as staff members took turns maintaining watch over Thunder, documenting every slight change in his behavior or condition. The bear, who had once been the symbol of rehabilitation failure, had become the embodiment of their collective determination to heal the wounds that institutional cruelty had inflicted. Frank Sullivan brought his military experience to bear on the crisis, organizing shift schedules and communication protocols that ensured Thunder was never alone. In the war, we never left a man behind. That principle doesn't change just because this soldier happens to have fur and claws. Michael felt the crushing weight of time running out as Thunder's condition deteriorated. Morrison's arrest had provided answers and justice, but it couldn't undo 8 years of psychological torture or restore the trust that systematic abuse had destroyed. The song that had once connected them seemed like a fragile thread stretched across an ocean of trauma and time. As darkness fell over the sanctuary, Michael made a decision that would either save Thunder's life or provide him with a peaceful death surrounded by love rather than institutional indifference. He would spend the night beside Thunder's enclosure, singing the songs that had once meant safety and belonging, regardless of whether the broken bear could still remember what those concepts meant. The Colorado mountain night settled over Wild Heart Sanctuary with the weight of finality, stars appearing one by one in the crystalline sky as Michael Harrison prepared for what might be his last conversation with Thunder. He had brought a thermos of coffee, a worn blanket that still carried Patricia's scent, and the guitar he hadn't touched since his wife's funeral 3 years ago. If Thunder was going to die, Michael was determined that his boy would hear the songs of their shared past echoing through the darkness. Dr. Coleman had initially protested Michael's vigil, citing safety protocols and liability concerns, but Margaret Thompson's fierce advocacy had worn down her professional resistance. "Patricia, that man has already lost his wife and spent 8 years believing he'd failed the only family he had left. If you deny him these final hours, you'll carry that guilt for the rest of your career." Frank Sullivan had volunteered to maintain watch from a respectful distance, his military instincts recognizing the sacred nature of Michael's commitment. At 78, the old veteran understood that some battles were won through presence rather than action, and some healing required nothing more than refusing to abandon those who needed witnesses to their pain. Thunder lay motionless in the corner of his enclosure, his massive frame reduced to labored breathing and the occasional twitch of an ear. 6 days without food had taken a devastating toll on his already traumatized system, and Dr. Coleman privately estimated that he had perhaps 12 hours before organ failure became irreversible. The bear, who had once commanded respect through his size and strength, now seemed fragile as spun glass, held together by nothing more than stubborn will. Michael settled into his folding chair beside the chain-link fence and tuned his guitar with hands that trembled from exhaustion and grief. "Hey there, Thunder Boy," he whispered into the darkness. "I know you're hurting, son. I know you've been hurting for a long time. But I want you to know that somebody fought for you. Somebody never stopped looking. Somebody never stopped loving you." The first notes of "You Are My Sunshine" drifted across the sanctuary grounds like a prayer offered to the mountain wind. Michael's voice, roughened by years of grief and disappointment, carried the melody that had once meant safety and belonging in a world that had shown Thunder nothing but cruelty since their separation. Thunder's ear twitched at the familiar sound, the first response he'd shown to human presence in over 24 hours. His breathing seemed to settle into a slightly more regular rhythm, though he didn't lift his massive head from where it rested on his paws. Michael continued singing, moving through the songs that had formed the soundtrack of their 3 months together 8 years ago. "Ring of Fire" because Thunder had always perked up at the dramatic opening chords. "Country Roads" because the bear used to hum along with the chorus. "Amazing Grace" because it was the hymn Patricia had requested at her funeral, and Michael needed to share that grief with the only family he had left. Margaret Thompson arrived at midnight with a fresh thermos of coffee and a plate of sandwiches that Michael ignored. She settled into a second chair without speaking, understanding that words would only intrude on the sacred conversation unfolding between man and bear. Her presence provided comfort without demanding acknowledgement, the gift of witnessed sorrow that she had learned to offer through decades of volunteer service. "I should have fought harder for you," Michael told Thunder as the night deepened around them. "When they took you away, I should have raised hell. I should have called every newspaper, every politician, every person with influence until somebody listened. Instead, I followed their rules and trusted their promises. And look where it got us. Thunder's massive head lifted slightly, dark eyes focusing with effort on the source of the familiar voice. The movement was minimal, barely perceptible in the darkness. But Margaret caught it and felt her heart leap with hope. "Michael," she whispered. "He's listening to you." Dr. Coleman made her midnight rounds with a heavy heart, checking on Thunder's condition while trying not to disturb the vigil taking place outside his enclosure. The bear's vital signs remained critically weak, but there was something different in his posture, a quality of attention that hadn't been present during the day. Against her better medical judgment, she found herself hoping that love might prove stronger than physiology. Frank Sullivan dozed fitfully in his truck, waking periodically to scan the sanctuary grounds with the vigilance that had kept him alive in Southeast Asian jungles. The old soldier understood that some battles were fought with weapons and strategy, while others required nothing more than the courage to remain present during another person's darkest hour. As the night wore on, Michael's repertoire expanded beyond their shared songs to include stories about Patricia, about the years of searching, about the dreams that had sustained him through the darkest periods of loss. "Your mama would have loved you, Thunder. She always said I had a gift for finding broken things and thinking I could fix them. But you weren't broken, boy. You were just lost." Thunder's responses grew gradually more pronounced as the hours passed. A soft exhalation that might have been recognition, a slight shifting of position that brought him closer to the fence. The faintest echo of the vocalization that had once meant contentment in their private language of trust and affection. Margaret documented each small change with the attention to detail that had made her an invaluable volunteer for 15 years. She understood that these moments might be Thunder's final communications, and somebody needed to bear witness to the love that had transcended 8 years of separation and systematic abuse. At 3 in the morning, Michael's voice began to give out from hours of continuous singing and talking. His throat was raw, his fingers cramped from guitar strings, but he refused to stop. Thunder needed to know that he wasn't alone, that his suffering had been witnessed, that his life had mattered to someone who would remember him with love rather than fear. "I keep thinking about that first night," Michael told Thunder, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were so small, so scared. Barely bigger than a house cat, but you had this stubborn streak that reminded me of Patricia when she got her mind set on something. You wouldn't let me leave the room. Every time I tried to step away, you'd cry until I came back." Thunder's breathing pattern shifted, becoming deeper and more regular. His massive head turned slightly toward the sound of Michael's voice, and in the darkness Margaret could have sworn she saw recognition flickering in his dark eyes. Dr. Coleman checked on them again at 4 a.m., bringing fresh coffee and a medical update that mixed hope with realism. His vital signs have stabilized somewhat, but he's still in critical condition. "Michael, I need you to understand that even if he survives the night, the psychological damage may be too severe for full recovery." Michael nodded without taking his eyes off Thunder. "Doc, I'm not asking for miracles. I'm just asking for a chance to let him know he was loved. If that's all we get, it's enough." As dawn approached, painting the eastern peaks in shades of gold and rose, something extraordinary happened. Thunder slowly, painfully, lifted his massive head and looked directly at Michael with eyes that held recognition, forgiveness, and a love that had somehow survived 8 years of brutality and separation. The sound that emerged from Thunder's throat was barely audible, a whisper of the joyful vocalizations that had once filled their cabin with music. But it was their sound, the private language they had shared during those precious months when the world was small enough to hold both a grieving man and an orphaned bear cub. Michael's tears fell freely as he reached through the fence, his fingers barely touching Thunder's massive paw. "There's my boy," he whispered. "There's my Thunder. I told you I'd never give up." "I told you I'd find you." Margaret Thompson wept openly as she watched Thunder struggle to his feet, his weakened body trembling with the effort of moving closer to the fence. The bear, who hadn't responded to human contact in months, pressed his scarred snout against the chain link, breathing in Michael's scent with the desperate intensity of a drowning man reaching for air. Dr. Coleman arrived to find man and bear sharing a moment of connection that transcended species boundaries and challenged everything she thought she knew about wildlife rehabilitation. Thunder was still critically ill, still traumatized by years of abuse, but the spark of recognition in his eyes suggested that love had indeed proven stronger than systematic cruelty. "We're going to need a specialized rehabilitation program," Patricia told Michael as Thunder settled back into a resting position but maintained visual contact with his human father. "This isn't going to be easy or quick. The psychological damage goes deep, and there are no guarantees about how much healing is possible." Michael stroked Thunder's massive paw through the fence, feeling the warmth of life that had almost slipped away during the night. "Doc, we've already waited 8 years. We can wait as long as it takes." Frank Sullivan arrived with the sunrise to find his neighbor transformed by hope and exhaustion. "How's our boy doing, Michael?" He remembered Frank. After everything they did to him, everything he's been through, he still remembered our song. Michael's voice broke with emotion as Thunder responded to Frank's arrival with a soft, huffing sound that might have been a greeting. The old veteran nodded with satisfaction. Course he remembered. Love like that doesn't just disappear because somebody tries to beat it out of you. It takes more than cruelty to break a bond like yours. As the sanctuary stirred to life around them, Michael continued his vigil beside Thunder's enclosure, no longer fearing that his boy might die alone, but committed to being present for every step of the healing journey ahead. The night had proven that 8 years of separation and suffering couldn't destroy the love between a man who had never stopped searching and a bear who had never stopped hoping. Thunder ate his first meal in 7 days that morning, accepting food from Dr. Coleman while maintaining constant visual contact with Michael. It was a small victory, but it represented the first step in a rehabilitation process that would prove that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in spite of trauma, but because someone refuses to give up hope that love can overcome even the most systematic cruelty. The sunrise painted the Rocky Mountain peaks in brilliant gold as man and bear began the long journey back to each other, surrounded by people who had learned that family isn't defined by species, but by the courage to keep fighting for those who matter most. 2 years later, Michael Harrison stood in the morning sunshine of Haven Valley Sanctuary, watching Thunder splash contentedly in the custom-built pond that had become the centerpiece of their new life together. At 57, Michael's face still carried the lines of grief and loss, but his eyes held a peace that had been absent for nearly a decade. Thunder, now fully recovered and weighing a healthy 450 pounds, had become not just a symbol of survival, but a testament to the healing power of unconditional love. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. The first 6 months after their reunion had tested everyone's patience and determination as Thunder slowly learned to trust again. Dr. Coleman had developed a revolutionary rehabilitation program that combined traditional veterinary medicine with trauma-informed care techniques typically reserved for human patients. The approach recognized that Thunder's behavioral issues weren't simply animal aggression, but complex psychological responses to systematic abuse. Margaret Thompson had become Thunder's unofficial grandmother, visiting daily with homemade treats and the gentle presence that had helped both man and bear navigate their darkest moments. Her volunteer work had expanded beyond Wild Heart Sanctuary to include advocacy for wildlife trafficking victims, and her testimony had been instrumental in securing federal funding for specialized rehabilitation programs across the country. Frank Sullivan, now 80, still made his weekly visits to Haven Valley, bringing military discipline to the sanctuary's security protocols and sharing war stories that somehow seemed to comfort Thunder during thunderstorms and other trigger events. The old veteran had found new purpose in protecting the healing sanctuary that Michael had built from the ashes of their shared trauma. Dr. Coleman had left her position at Wild Heart Sanctuary to join Michael as co-director of Haven Valley, bringing her expertise to bear on cases that traditional wildlife rehabilitation couldn't address. The facility had become a research center for understanding the long-term effects of trauma on highly intelligent animals, with findings that were revolutionizing approaches to wildlife conservation worldwide. The sanctuary itself sprawled across 200 acres of pristine Colorado wilderness, funded through a combination of private donations, federal grants, and the proceeds from Michael's book about his search for Thunder. 8 years of searching, a father's journey to save his son, had become a bestseller, touching hearts around the world and raising awareness about the emotional complexity of human-animal relationships. Thunder's daily routine reflected the careful balance between wild nature and healing relationship that defined his recovery. Mornings began with their traditional greeting ritual, Michael singing "You Are My Sunshine," while Thunder responded with the gentle huffing sounds that had once filled their cabin with joy. The bear had free access to 40 acres of natural habitat, but always returned to the observation deck where Michael spent his afternoons writing and planning the sanctuary's expansion. The legal aftermath of Vincent Morrison's arrest had sent shockwaves through the wildlife management community. Morrison's trafficking network had been responsible for the illegal transport of over 300 animals across state lines, generating millions of dollars in black market sales while destroying countless lives in the process. His conviction on federal charges had resulted in a 30-year prison sentence and fundamental reforms in wildlife oversight procedures. Jake Sullivan, the FBI agent who had infiltrated Morrison's operation, had become a regular visitor to Haven Valley and a close friend to Michael. His undercover work had exposed corruption in multiple state wildlife agencies and led to the prosecution of dozens of trafficking accomplices. Jake's respect for the bond between Michael and Thunder had grown into advocacy for recognizing the legal rights of animals who formed deep emotional connections with their human caregivers. Haven Valley's success had attracted international attention from researchers studying interspecies relationships and trauma recovery. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Barcelona had spent 6 months documenting Thunder's rehabilitation, producing groundbreaking research on the neurological impacts of separation anxiety in highly intelligent animals. Her work had been published in Nature and cited in legal briefs supporting expanded protections for animals in emotional support relationships. The sanctuary housed 12 other rescued animals, each with their own story of survival and recovery. Luna, a female black bear rescued from an illegal circus, had become Thunder's closest companion and eventual mate. Their relationship had blossomed slowly under Michael's patient guidance, two traumatized souls finding comfort in shared understanding of what it meant to survive human cruelty. The birth of Thunder and Luna's cubs had brought unexpected joy to the sanctuary community. Hope and Freedom, named by Margaret Thompson in a moment of poetic inspiration, had inherited their father's unusual intelligence and their mother's gentle strength. At 18 months old, they were already displaying the complex communication patterns that had made Thunder legendary among animal behaviorists. Michael's role had evolved from desperate searcher to respected authority on wildlife trauma recovery. Universities across the country invited him to speak about his experience, and his testimony before Congress had been crucial in passing the Companion Animal Protection Act, legislation that recognized the legal standing of certain human-animal relationships and provided federal protections against arbitrary separation. The emotional healing had been as important as the practical achievements. Michael's grief over Patricia's death had slowly transformed from paralyzing guilt to bittersweet acceptance. Thunder's recovery had taught him that love doesn't disappear when circumstances change, that healing is possible even after severe trauma, and that sometimes the most meaningful family relationships transcend traditional boundaries. Dr. Coleman's research at Haven Valley had documented remarkable developments in Thunder's cognitive abilities post-recovery. The bear had learned over 60 distinct vocalizations for communicating with humans, could recognize his name in written form, and showed problem-solving skills that challenged existing assumptions about ursine intelligence. Most significantly, he had begun teaching these communication patterns to his cubs, creating what appeared to be a learned cultural tradition within the bear family. The sanctuary's educational programs had welcomed over 10,000 visitors in the past year, sharing Thunder's story with school groups, wildlife professionals, and families dealing with their own experiences of loss and separation. The most popular program featured Michael and Thunder's morning greeting ritual, a demonstration of interspecies communication that left audiences amazed and inspired. Margaret Thompson's volunteer coordination had expanded to include a network of retired educators and child development specialists who helped design age-appropriate programming about empathy, resilience, and the importance of never giving up on those we love. Her monthly newsletter reached subscribers in 47 states and 12 countries, spreading awareness about wildlife trafficking while celebrating stories of successful rehabilitation. Frank Sullivan's security expertise had been crucial in protecting the sanctuary from protesters who objected to the close human-animal relationships on display. His military experience with managing hostile situations had proven invaluable when dealing with extremist groups who viewed Haven Valley's approach as dangerous anthropomorphism that threatened public safety. The financial sustainability of Haven Valley had been secured through a combination of innovative funding streams that Michael had never imagined during his desperate years of searching. Corporate sponsorships from ethical outdoor gear companies provided operational funding, while merchandise sales featuring Thunder's image supported expansion projects. The sanctuary's success had proven that wildlife conservation could be economically viable when it touched people's hearts as well as their minds. Thunder's impact extended far beyond the sanctuary's borders. His story had inspired the creation of similar facilities in 7 states, each designed to address the specific needs of wildlife trafficking victims. The Thunder Foundation, established with royalties from Michael's book, provided grants to support rehabilitation programs that might otherwise lack funding for the intensive care required by severely traumatized animals. The daily reality of life at Haven Valley was both extraordinary and surprisingly ordinary. Michael still woke each morning to Thunder's gentle huffing outside his cabin window, still shared his afternoon coffee while the bear dozed in the sunshine, still sang their bedtime songs that had sustained them both through years of separation and healing. The routine that had once been born of desperate hope had become the foundation of a life filled with purpose and contentment. As Michael watched Thunder teach his cubs to recognize the melody of "You Are My Sunshine," he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. The man who had once been willing to sacrifice everything to find his lost boy had discovered that love wasn't about possession or control, but about creating space for healing and growth. The bear, who had survived years of systematic abuse, had learned to trust again, not just one human, but an entire community committed to his well-being. The setting sun painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and purple as Thunder approached the deck where Michael sat writing in his journal. The massive bear settled beside his human father with the contentment of an animal who knew he was safe, loved, and home. In the distance, hope and freedom played in the meadow, while Luna watched with the patient attention of a mother who understood that some gifts are too precious to take for granted. Haven Valley Sanctuary stood as proof that love could overcome even the most systematic cruelty, that family relationships could transcend species boundaries, and that healing was possible for even the most broken hearts. In the gentle evening breeze, Michael could almost hear Patricia's voice whispering approval of the life he had built from the ashes of loss, and Thunder's soft breathing reminded him that sometimes the most important victories are measured not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of shared peace. Message for American seniors, 200 words. Like many of us who've reached our golden years, Michael Harrison knew the heartbreak of loss and the weight of carrying on alone. At 55, after losing his beloved wife Patricia to cancer and facing financial ruin from medical bills, he could have given up on the one relationship that still mattered. Instead, he chose to keep searching for Thunder, the bear cub he'd rescued and loved like a son, even when everyone told him it was hopeless. For 8 years, Michael sacrificed everything, his home, his savings, his reputation, because he understood that real love doesn't have an expiration date. We've all been there, haven't we? Holding on to hope when logic says, let go, fighting for family when others say we're foolish. Michael's story reminds us that the relationships we nurture with patience and devotion, whether with children, grandchildren, or even a rescued animal, have the power to heal wounds we thought would never mend. At our age, we know that time is precious, but we also know that love is stronger than time. Sometimes the very act of refusing to give up on someone becomes the miracle that saves us both. Discussion questions. Have you ever refused to give up on a relationship when others told you it was hopeless? What kept you fighting? What unexpected family member, pet, neighbor, friend has brought healing to your life during difficult times? Please share your own stories of love and perseverance in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've experienced the healing power of never giving up on those who matter most.